So today I'm going to be looking at two watches here, the Hamilton on my right and the Seiko on my left. I apologize in advance if this video is a little long, but there will be timestamps below in case you want to skip to a certain part or just want to hear my final thoughts. Let's get into it. So today I'm going to be doing a kind of battle between these two watches. I would consider this Seiko 5 and this Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical to be probably the two best field styled watches at their price points, respectfully. And really under $300, you really can't find anything comparable that could beat it, especially if you're looking mechanical wise. Before I get too much into these watches, I just want to kind of go over the history of the two brands. For Hamilton, they were founded in 1892, and they really became popular for their timekeeping standards, the first in the railroad industry around the early 1910s, and then they became very popular because they supplied watches to both World War I and World War II, so they really got a big claim to fame there. From there, they became very large in the aviation industry. In 1918 specifically, they had like the first airmail flight, I believe. And after that, they had the first flight to the North Pole, and they became an official timekeeper for, I think, about 4 different airlines in the 1930s. So they were just really on top of the whole timekeeping and branching out to multiple industries kind of thing. By the 1950s, Hamilton decided to pioneer in the industry with the Hamilton electric watch, which was kind of a hybrid between quartz and mechanical, it still was a mechanical gears movement, but it had a kind of electro power supply instead of a normal mainspring. The watch was cool and it was different, but it ended up, not really living very long unless you go into the Seiko spring drive, which is a kind of improvement on that type of technology. And from there, in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, they were acquired by the Swatch Group, and in 2003 they moved to Switzerland. So up until that point, all the way from 1892, they were an American-based brand, but in 2003 they moved to Switzerland, claiming because they wanted to be able to be fully Swiss-made watches. Now for Seiko, their history is just as impressive. It is maybe slightly earlier, I would say, although they were both founded around the same time. In 1892, Seikosha was founded, which was like the prelude to Seiko, but it wasn't until 1924 that the first Seiko branded watch was released. From there, they became the official Japanese railroad timekeeper in 1926, so again, a little tie between the two brands with the railroad heritage. And throughout the decades, they were a timekeeper for many athletic events, and then Seiko started with its innovations. In the 1950s, they came out with both Dia-shock and the magic lever system. The Dia-shock is just a shock kind of protectant to help with bumps and dropping of a watch, and then the magic lever is a kind of two-way system that allows a automatic watch to be winded more efficiently. So that really helped the automatic watch industry. In 1969, Seiko released their first quartz watch, and it was pretty much one of the first quartz watches in the world, and that pretty much started the quartz watch crisis and almost destroyed the whole mechanical watch industry. So Seiko's pretty crazy there. And in 1999, they released the spring drive technology, which was in the works for over 20 years. And as mentioned to earlier, it's electromagnetic, mechanical hybrid type of movement that's super, super accurate, more accurate than your traditional mechanical watch. And they've just been refining that for the past decades. And now we're on to these two watches. I would say these are both pretty much the entry level of the brands, especially in the mechanical sense. Seiko, you can definitely get slightly cheaper watches, but not cheaper automatic watches. Right now I don't have them on straps just because I want to take the watch in their full essence. I will change them, or at least put straps on them in a little bit. But right now, let's just start off with some dimensions and see how they compare and contrast to each other in that regard. We got the caliper. So on the Seiko, we have about a 37 millimeter diameter with a lug to lug of 40, with a lug to lug of 42.8, so about 43, a thickness of about 10.5, and a lug width of 18. So for the Hamilton, we're going to have a width of about 38 millimeters, so slightly larger, a lug to lug of 47, so again slightly larger, and a thickness of about 9.5, so thinner than the Seikos, and a lug width of 20. So straight off the bat, we see the Hamilton has a little bit larger proportions. It is slightly larger in the case diameter as well as the case length, but slimmer in the case itself, which we will get to later. This is something I've never done, but I just want to kind of see what the size of the dials are. So on the Seiko, we have about a 30 millimeter dial. And on the Hamilton, we have about a 32 millimeter dial. So even though the Hamilton's only 1 millimeter bigger, the dial itself is about 2 millimeters bigger, which just goes in to show that the Hamilton has a more expansive dial. It takes up more space. It's going to be a little bit more legible. And I think that also goes towards it looking a little bit more proportional within itself. Something I really want to point out on the Hamilton is how defined its case shape is. It's quite literally almost like an H. The lug cut out very sharply at the top and come to very fine, very straight point at the end. They're very long, and with some straps you even get a gap between the case and the lugs because it's just such a long lug length. But the case itself is very curvy. The lug length is not too long, so it sits on the wrist very well. And it's not a very thick watch either. The Seiko, by comparison, is a little stubbier. The lugs don't go as far out, especially in comparison to the case itself. It's a little fatter, so it's kind of a little more squat on the wrist. But overall, neither of them wears badly on the wrist. And I would say the recessed crown here that's at the 4 o'clock instead of the 3 is a little more comfortable than the very large crown at the 3 here. So I guess that's a little bit of advantage for the Seiko. So now that we've taken dimensions and I've showed you kind of how their case shapes stand out, I could put these back on straps. And put them both on purlons because I feel like it matches with both the military aesthetic and I just like purlon straps. The straps that each of the watches come with are not terrible, but they're also not the best. And for the prices, you can obviously go and find your own straps and it won't be too bad on you. We see that these watches look pretty similar and they do both call to a field watch style aesthetic. So let's get the pricing out of the way just to kind of put them on the field and see what levels they stand at. So the Hamilton Khaki Field, if you buy it new from Hamilton, will be $425. Now, if you go either used market or gray market, you can easily find them under $300, and used market, they usually travel around the $200 mark. For the Seiko, currently on Amazon, this black dial variant is about $80. And they also have variants with a blue dial, a beige dial. I think they have an Amazon special red dial. So you could all find those for about the same amount of price. They used to be around $50, but prices do fluctuate. I've recently haven't seen them for under around 70 to 80, so I think that's their new starting point. But I think anywhere under $100 for this watch is pretty amazing, as you get a mechanical movement, automatic movement, a see-through case back, so you can actually see the inner workings of the watch. So that's just pretty cool. So we have a pretty drastic price difference. If we take, let's say, the Hamilton to be around $250 and the Seiko to be around $80, this watch is about 3 times the Seiko. So the question has to be posed, we have 2 black dial field watches here, and what do you get for the difference in price? And for me, I think the Hamilton is worth the extra price. I think the Seiko is a very compelling watch. It's a very great watch for the price, and many people will be happy with the Seiko. But there are also reasons to gravitate towards the Hamilton. So the Hamilton actually has a couple things that justify the price, I would say. First of all, we have a slightly domed sapphire crystal, while on the Seiko we have a flat hardlex crystal, which is practically a mineral crystal, so it's less scratch resistant. So that's something that most people would consider a plus for the Hamilton. Brand heritage, they're pretty much similar / a washout there, so it's not like one's amazingly greater than the other. If we look at the movements, for the Seiko, we have the Seiko 7S26 movement, which is a tried and true movement. It's very reliable. It has a slower beat rate of 21,600, so you will be able to see a visible tick along that. But there is also a hidden benefit in there, as since it's a slower beat rate, that means there's less wear on the mechanical movements. So in technicality, there's a greater longevity to the life of the movement in this watch. Whereas in the Hamilton, we have the ETA 2804-2 movement beating at 28,800 beats per hour. So a little bit higher beat rate, a lot smoother sweep to the seconds hand. A little bit more wear on the movement, but I would still say the Hamilton pulls ahead here because the ETA movement is, I would say, more serviceable. If you're looking at this watch, you have it for 10 years, it stops working, or it starts working weirdly, you want to service it, you might as well just buy a new one, because the price to service it would be more than the price of the watch. For the ETA, the price to service it may be similar to the price of the watch, possibly more expensive, but the parts would be more available. I have talked to a watchmaker, and he said some Seiko parts are just hard to get because they just don't get serviced a lot of the time. So if you were to choose to service this watch, it would be expensive, and for the Hamilton, it'd be less expensive / more reasonable to do so on a watch of this price, and I would say of this quality as well. One thing I think is very different between the watches is, although they look very similar, the dials are different. We have the 12-hour numerals here with the 24-hour inner markings, and here we have 12-hour inner markings with a 5 to 60 outer marking. So this watch, I would say, really is very good for teaching someone how to tell time, because we have the hour hands literally pointing to the hours 1 through 12, and the minutes hand literally pointing to the minutes 5 through 60. So it's very intuitive to read the time, while this is more a military time aesthetic, military time function watch. So it's either 1 or it's either 1300, you know what I mean? So I also think because of the smaller numbers, it doesn't go up to 55, it doesn't have greater breadth of numbers as it does on the Seiko. I think this one looks cleaner overall. Something I really do like about the Seiko, however, is that it has a matched date wheel. So we have the black dial, the white numerals, and we also have a black date disc and white numerals and white lettering for the months. One thing I don't like about this date wheel is, you can kind of see it right there, is the date coloration is sometimes a weirder, different shade of black than the rest of the dial. So it just kind of looks weird in certain lights, and you just chop that up to, it's a cheaper watch, or not cheaper, just more affordable styled watch. And some corners are cut, it's not going to all be perfect. It's not going to be similar to a $10,000 field watch, It's acceptable for the price range, but it is something that's there, so it's something I'm going to mention. When we look at the finishing of the cases, with the Hamilton, we have a very fine bead blasted finished. It's very fine, very well done. And the coating holds up very, very well. I've had this watch previously. This is a newer watch. I've rebought it. But I've had this watch previously, worn the heck out of it, and it pretty much looks brand new because the coating's so good on it. And you see at this price range, not only do we get, kind of the better coating to the watch, but we get drilled lug holes, and we get, it's not a blasted back, but we get a brushed back, but it looks less stark than if that would have been polished. It's a nicer transition. Also blasted between the lugs, and we get a nice blasted and signed knurled crown. If we look at the Seiko, we also have a similar kind of coating. It's less fine. It's not as apparent, I would say. Like, holding them both in hand, you can tell inherently that the Hamilton is a little higher quality. But this one looks good. It's even. It's uniform. There's not a bunch of imperfections in it. It looks good. But the thing I think is the most dramatic, and where this kind of like loses its design sense, is it has this nice brushed kind of finished, this blasted finish, and then it has a highly polished case back and a highly polished lug area there. And I feel like that just ruins the whole aesthetic of it. It's such a stark contrast, and it just breaks from the uniformity. And it's not really breaking in a pleasing way. It's breaking in a, why did they do that kind of way. But it's also probably a cost-cutting measure, which is again why it is a sub $100 watch. Something I really, really appreciate and commend about this watch, though, is the see-through case back. Although it's not a highly decorated Patek Philippe movement, it's still a mechanical beating watch. You see the balance running away there, and you can turn this over and know that thousands of little parts, well, not probably hundreds, not thousands, of little parts are working in tandem just to tell you the time. And that's pretty awesome. Yeah, that's probably one of the best parts about this watch. The fact that it's mechanical and has a see-through case back on under $100. Sometimes I do wish the Hamilton had a see-through case back, but it's also a field watch. It doesn't need to have a see-through case back. It has no use technically for one, but also, why not? We just wear watches to school, to the office. So if we need to go diving, if we need something that's a little more rough, we'll get a different watch, Speaking of diving, they both have a water resistance of 50 meters, and neither of them have screw-down crowns. They're not the most water-resistant watches ever. But these are field watches, not dive watches, so that's understandable. They both do have Lume on the dials, and let's show that really quick. So you can see they both glow green. The Seiko has Lume on all the pips, as well as the hour hands and on the lollipop seconds. The Hamilton also has Lume on all the pips rounds, on the hands, as well as the whole second hand, as well as the arrow of the second hand. It's a little hard to pick up here, but you can kind of see it. That whole hand is loomed, and that's honestly pretty cool. Now, surprisingly, the Seiko kind of starts beating the Hamilton in the loom department. It's not too surprising, as Seiko is pretty renowned for how great their loom is, but it does kind of sting a little to see that this $80 watch is doing better than the $300 watch in the loom. But honestly, loom is something I don't use very often, but it's a nice thing to have. It's a reassuring thing. But very cool nonetheless. They both have it. They're both functional. You can both read them in the dark, but it's not like it's going to last all night. So let's see how these watches wear. Previously, I was wearing my Orient Star Classic on this green silicone band. I love this watch. So on the wrists, I have a 6.5 inch wrist. We have the Hamilton Khaki mechanical. So we see we have the 38 millimeter diameter, which is it's a pretty good size. It'll fit most wrists. The lug length is somewhat large, but it is accommodating to both small and large wrists. Again, I have a 6.5 inch wrist, which is on the smaller size, and this watch wears completely fine on me. I would say the way that these lugs just cut off so starkly and so just boom, there's no curvature, like not extreme curvature, it's just very stark, kind of adds to the beefiness of the watch. It gives it a more aggressive stance, which is kind of cool for a military inspired watch. You know, it fits in with the idea. But I think the watch wears very well. It's very thin. I think it looks great. Personally, I would prefer like maybe a 36 millimeter model. It just would have fit me a tiny bit better, but I have no problems with the sizing, really. It's just picking at it. Now for the Seiko, we have a slightly smaller diameter and an even smaller lug to lug length. And I've seen many pictures online of some people wearing the Seiko, and we can see it wears a lot smaller than the Hamilton did. And on a wrist like mine, that's completely fine. You know, I have a small wrist, it looks fine, it looks great. But once you start getting to medium-sized wrists and larger wrists, like 7.5 to 8 inches, it starts looking like a very dainty watch. That's a fine as a style. Like, I wear 32 millimeter watches with no problem. But some people just don't like a watch that small. They like a little beefiness. They like a little more presence to their watch. So that's where the Hamilton would win over the Seiko. The Seiko is great. It would work great as a young kid's watch, a teenager's watch. It would work great as a work watch, as a beater watch. I used to have a green dial variant that I wore to the gym every day for about a year. It performed amazingly. It ran at like plus 1 second a day. And I love that watch. And it's comfortable. It wears well. The coating holds up pretty well, but it does get scratches. I would say probably easier a little bit than the Hamilton. But overall, it's a great watch. And it wears well. Now, as I mentioned, I previously had a Seiko 5, and that ran at plus 1 seconds a day, which is not the norm. That's very amazing accuracy for a very inexpensive watch. Currently, this Hamilton is running at about plus 3 seconds a day, and the manufacturer specifications give it around, I think, a plus 12, minus 12-ish kind of range for it to be at, and it is within that range. And that's also where the extra money is going. You know, you're paying for the accuracy of the watch. The Seiko 5 is quoted at around plus 30, minus 30 seconds a day. A lot of them perform better than that, as my previous one did, but the one I have here performs a lot worse than that, actually. I think the last time I checked, this one was performing at, I don't know if it was, I think minus 3 seconds a day. Not 3 seconds, sorry. Minus 3 minutes a day, which surprised me a lot because I never had a watch work that ineffectively, you know. But it's really a luck of the draw. Sometimes these they're not the most expensive watches. Sometimes these movements fail. The quality control sometimes isn't there. And that's just the name of the game, you know. But You can always return it, get a new one, possibly take it to your watchmaker, have them regulated. It wouldn't be too hard to do that. And it is a good movement in itself. But at the end of the day, these are both great watches. One's more affordable and would make a great beater watch. This one is a little more expensive and would also make a great beater watch. It just depends on whether you appreciate the more robustness of the sapphire coating, the probably slightly better and more scratch resistant coating on the case. If you appreciate the thinness that comes with the hand winding movement, the drilled lug holes, which make strap changing a lot easier. Or if you want like the smaller, more reserved size of this. Something I did forget to mention is the Hamilton is hacking and hand winding, meaning you can hand wind it to charge it up, which you have to since it's not an automatic. And when you pull the crown out, the time stops, which just helps with accuracy. For the Seiko, you cannot hand wind it, but it has an automatic rotor, so that helps, and you can always do the little Seiko shuffle and charge it up that way. But when you pull the crown out, the movement does not stop. So it's a little harder to get an accurate reading. It's a little harder to sync it up with time sources, but it's not that much of a big deal, especially again at that under $100 price point. So in the end, I think you can't really go wrong with either one. If you're a little more budget oriented, there's nothing wrong with going with the Seiko 5. But if you really want to step up, if you want a little bit more refinement, if you want a watch that just has a little bit extra, has those things that people appreciate, the Swiss made factor, it has the higher degree of accuracy, the higher pedigree of being Swiss made and having higher end components like the sapphire crystal. If you want all that, then the Hamilton is an amazing watch. It was a trustworthy watch. It looks great on pretty much every strap. And it has 20mm lugs, so finding straps and using them between watches is a lot easier than the 18mm lugs over here, which for some people will be a little too dainty, and some others may not just have a lot of 18mm straps, so it's more convenient to go with the Hamilton. But you really can't go wrong with either. They share a lot of elements. They both are field styles. They both have lollipop seconds hands. And they're both just good looking watches. I've owned both of these watches. I've loved both of these watches. And it really comes down to choice. The Seiko, I would say, fits a little better on smaller wrists. The Hamilton would have more presence on bigger ones. But the Hamilton fits just as well on smaller wrists like mine, which have a little bit of a flatter top. It just depends on your case, and I would always highly recommend for you to try on a watch first, if you can. And if you can't, probably go with the Seiko because it's a cheaper entry point, you know. But either of these would make a great addition to any collection. Thanks for watching.